No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Companies and Affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. A few weeks ago, our manager sent me a new sponsor proposal by a company called Quince. So I dutifully went to check out their website, and before I knew it, I had already made my first purchase. My lovely wife, Laura, had told me I was embarrassing her the way I was dressed when going to the Y. So I found the perfect navy performance tech shorts that would have cost me 2 to 3 times more at the store where I had considered getting some gym wear. And now I'm so pleased. I'm waiting on my new summer shirt to come in, along with some European linen drawstring shorts. Quince has all the things we actually want to wear, like organic cotton silk polos, those European linen beach shorts, and comfortable pants that work for everything, from backyard hangs to nice dinners. Plus, they have high ethical commitments in manufacturing practices, a commitment of which I'm especially fond. And yes, the good stuff keeps coming. Everything with Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than what you'd find at similar brands. So yes, I am a new fan of Quince. You can elevate your closet with Quince. Go to quince.com/endeavor for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's Quince, QUINCE.com/endeavor to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/endeavor. Enjoy. I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
These are things we can do privately every day and profoundly change our capacity to act effectively in the world.
Today on the show, a compilation of key practices that contribute to mental and emotional well-being, and those in turn are good too for your body.
These brief doses help your heart, your immune system, they help your stress.
In conversation with some of the world's best researchers on psychological well-being, we'll explore the science of awe, self-compassion, and stress, and the number one factor contributing to human happiness.
Relationships keep us happier and healthier throughout our lifespan.
A compendium of ways to better care for yourself.
Self-compassion is just caring about yourself, right? Your sense of worth comes from the fact that you're a human being like all other human beings.
All coming right up.
The world's hardest problems can't wait. Food security, energy resilience, the digital divide. I'm Astro Teller. For 15 years, I've worked with inventors and engineers to tackle the seemingly impossible. In the Moonshot podcast, we take you inside X, Google's Moonshot Factory, giving you unprecedented access to the messy, exhilarating journey of turning science fiction into reality. This is the Moonshot Podcast, out now wherever you listen.
I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. Since 2020, we've been interviewing psychologists, therapists, philosophers, theologians, scientists, poets, and more, all to explore what it means to live a good life. Alternatively put, we're asking questions about human flourishing. How do we move beyond mere survival or subsistence to some sort of thriving, some sense of purpose, meaning, connection, possibly even joy? Today, we compile for you some of the common themes and practices we've seen repeatedly rise to the top, and in particular, we'll attend to psychological and mental well-being, with our attention given to practices often enjoined by numerous religious and wisdom traditions, while also being commended by evidence-based scientific research. Take the example of Dacher Keltner, who's a professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and the faculty director of UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center. He suggests a threefold outline for thinking about practices for human flourishing.
I look at the field of well-being, and there are different theoretical frameworks. I really reduce it to a few things. One is just these deep intuitions that so many contemplative traditions like Taoism, Buddhism, Romanticism taught us to go in search of: compassion, awe, gratitude, a sense of wonder. The second is sociality, is just cultivate an ethics of connection and a sense of cooperation with people, of friendship, of common cause. 40% of Americans feel lonely right now. They don't have enough connection. And so there are actionable ways to do that. And then the third is, how do you handle stress? How do you practice meditation techniques and tell stories? And how can we make sense of it? How can we grow out of it? And it's really dynamic. It's all the approaches don't work for everybody. You got to find your particular menu in a way to go after meaning.
Today, we'll give you a good number of options to try on your particular menu. And for our organization in this episode, we'll follow Dacher's three main categories of well-being. 1, the human intuitions embraced by a great variety of traditions. 2, sociability, connection, friendship. And 3, how we respond to stress. Again, with endorsements for each of these categories of practices from scientific research. So for that first category of finding well-being in our deep human intuitions, we'll let Dacher share with us the surprising positive effects that come from experiencing one particular emotion.
Awe is the feeling we have when we encounter vast, mysterious things. It's so good for you. Brief doses of awe help your heart, your immune system. They help your stress. They help your reasoning. You become a sharper reasoner. They help you with your relationships, experiences of awe.
So give us kind of a big picture of some of the main things that you've learned in the study of awe.
First thing is we feel awe in response to what I call the 8 wonders of life, which is the moral beauty of people, nature, collective moving in unison or effervescence, art, music, spiritual contemplation, and then big ideas, right? Like God, quantum physics. And then really interestingly, life and death, the cycle of life.
Let's dig in just briefly and expound just a bit more on kind of the health and well-being fruit of experiencing awe.
I'll start with 2 findings recently from our lab. We took veterans out rafting, awesome trip for a day. And what we find is a week later, because of awe, through this rafting, they have a 32% drop in PTSD, which is a very hard condition. Just recently, we published a paper where, medical doctors, nurses, during the peak pandemic, chaos in the hospitals, 30% understaffed, 1 million people dying without their families. I did a lot of work with healthcare providers, and it was like combat. And we just had them find a moment of awe each day, just like pause, open your mind to something big that you're part of, just reflect on it, breathe. And they had reductions in depression and anxiety and loneliness over 30 days, right? So that tells us just a minute or 2 of this is good for us. In the body, we know awe activates the vagus nerve, which is this large bundle of nerves in your body, slows your heart, helps you vocalize, helps you orient to people, helps you connect, right? Awe activates that. Awe reduces inflammation. This work that your immune system does, it heats up your body to kill pathogens. If you're chronically inflamed, it is so hard on your body, right? And awe cools down the inflammation response at a chronic level. So that just tells us, man, it's good for your body. And then, I think the big story psychologically, awe takes us out of the self. It quiets down the self, even at the neurological level. And it prompts you to think like, what am I part of that's bigger than me? That spiritual systems have done a good job of getting us to think about. But awe does this as well. Like, wow, I'm moved by this music. Why? Like, what themes of life does this speak to me about? And awe does that work for us in the moment.
So let me ask about this. And you talk about these, I think it was 8 ways that people experience awe. I was especially moved by your description of the way in which our observation of moral beauty can move us towards awe, that seeing other people's courage, kindness, strength, or their overcoming can move us towards that. What are ways that you have seen that, either personally, or what are ways that you have seen that in your research?
Oh my goodness. The finding on moral beauty caught us off guard in the lab. We studied 26 countries. We asked people to write stories of awe, just their own experience, not a scientist telling them what to say, but their own experience in countries from Mexico to India. And, I was expecting nature and spirituality, and in came the findings that what we called moral beauty, that other people's, everyday people, how they give, how they sacrifice, how they stand up to abuses of power, how they risk their lives courageously, how they overcome obstacles. I remember this incredible story of a son writing about his dad, and his dad grew up in poverty. Parents died young. He married this wonderful woman. They had a bunch of kids. She died young. He worked until he was 90 just to get all the kids to a stable life. And the son was at his birthday party for the dad, and he just was blown away by his dad's sacrifice. We know that it's one of the deepest ways in which we can find the meaningful life is to surround ourselves with other people's moral beauty, to read about it, read about Gandhi, to look for it in the streets, and you see how kind young kids are, to think about your mentors in life or even a spiritual figure. What that does is it leads us through this pattern of awe of like, man, like this is what I really care about then. It moves my body, it moves my mind to think about ways to emulate the virtuous acts I've seen. Once that finding started to come in, I started to think, and I hope our audience is, about where do I find my experiences of moral beauty? And for me, in part, it was this work I did in prisons through restorative justice. I'd be inside the prison with 180 prisoners, just me and a handful of volunteers. We're there all day. These are guys who've had the hardest lives, you know. Many of them have killed people. And watching them try to seek forgiveness and redemption and better their lives, and the humanity of it all, every time I was in there, I was just filled with tears and goosebumps. And I was like, why is that? What is this, you know? And it was moral beauty, just the urge for these prisoners to overcome their pasts and seek forgiveness. So that's one example. And suddenly, you know, it's a great exercise to think about, where else have I found this? How have I found this in literature? You know, when I first read the Brothers Karamazov and I encountered Alyosha, it was my first encounter with a saint in a way. So, you know, it's a great exercise for us all personally to think about, where do we get moved to tears by other people?
Any closing encouragement or exposition on a bit more on cultivating everyday forms of awe for us?
Yeah, you know, I wrote this book when I was grieving the loss of my younger brother, which was a devastating experience. I was knocked off the rails. And as I write in the book, I was like, God, I do this science of awe, I'm going to go find it. And it changed my life. And finding it is just take a moment every day, slow it down, put away your usual labels and expectations, and observe and breathe and be open to big, vast things, you know. And you can do that. You know, I'm looking at a cactus right now and feeling it. You can look at the sky, listen to music, look at somebody's eyes, you know, watch children play, whatever it is. Just the awe mindset's about slowing down, quieting the voice of the self, and opening up to think about those systems you're part of, or however you define it. And then the second thing is, you know, those 8 wonders those are great ways we can find it. Music, nature, spiritual practice, prayer, big ideas, looking at visual things, and just make it part of your day for a few minutes. And it changed my life. So I hope our listeners will take a look at it and think about moments of awe for their lives.
Often after conducting an interview for the show, I find myself trying out new practices, which our guests recommend. One quite helpful practice in recent years is a self-compassion exercise, which I learned from Kristin Neff. Kristin is a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research. As you'll hear her discuss, self-compassion exercises have measurable impacts, increasing happiness and decreasing depression. Conventional wisdom has it that human flourishing requires heavy doses of high self-esteem. But Kristin is a vocal critic of the cult of self-esteem, saying that the biggest problem with self-esteem is that it tends to be contingent, she says, that an undue focus upon self-esteem can lead us to only feeling good about ourselves when we succeed. Instead, her research points to the alternative that is not contingent on success, namely self-compassion.
Self-compassion, it's also a sense of self-worth, but it's not a judgment or an evaluation that one is good versus bad. It's simply compassion, concern with the alleviation of suffering. It's just caring about yourself, right? Your sense of worth comes from the fact that you're a human being like all other human beings, as precious as any other. And so self-compassion is really about supporting oneself, being there for oneself when times are difficult. And by the way, because it's compassion, it's particular to the context of suffering. Actually, in the Latin, passion means to suffer, con means with. So it's a way of being with yourself in times of suffering, whether that's because you failed or made a mistake or feeling inadequate in some way, or something like the pandemic, or you have a health condition or something's going on in your life that's very difficult. It's a way of relating to yourself in times of suffering with kindness, care, and connection. It's not self-pity. It's not like, woe is me. It's just recognizing, hey, life is difficult for everyone. I'm a human being like all other human beings. And the research is just phenomenally powerful in terms of showing that if you can relate to your difficulties with compassion as opposed to harsh judgment or shame or feelings of isolation, it makes us much stronger and healthier mentally and physically, actually.
You've talked about at least 3 different components of self-compassion, and one being just kind of kindness to ourselves. So could you tell us a little bit more about that one?
You might say the emotional tone of compassion is one of warmth and kindness, right? As opposed to being harsh or judgmental, the way actually most of us are. Most of us tend not to be kind to ourselves, especially when we've made a mistake. So just as compassion for a friend means you're kind and warm and supportive to that friend, we're also kind and warm and supportive to ourselves. But it's more than kindness alone. The reason it's compassion and not just kindness, the reason I didn't just call it self-kindness is because there's 2 other elements. One is actually mindfulness. So I actually learned about self-compassion as part of my mindfulness meditation practice. That's where I learned about it. In the Buddhist tradition, it makes absolutely no sense to be compassionate to others, but not yourself, because of course the self and the other are interconnected, right? In order to give ourselves compassion for suffering, we need to be able to be present with it. In other words, if we ignored it, if we pretend it's not there, or we just stiff upper lip it, or on the other hand, if we're lost in it, if we have no perspective, we're just like wallowing in it, we actually can't have compassion. And so mindfulness, the awareness of, wow, I'm really having a hard time right now. Is there anything I can do to help? In order to ask that question, we actually need to have some mindful awareness of our pain. That's really the first step. And so you're mindful of your pain, you're kind to yourself because it hurts, basically. And then really important, a sense of interconnectedness, of common humanity, I call it. So what's the difference between pity and compassion, right? So if I pity you, I'm looking down on you, I'm feeling sorry for you. Or if I'm involved in self-pity, I'm feeling sorry for myself. Pity is different than compassion. So compassion is like, hey, I've been there. There's an inherent sense of connectedness, of humanity in the experience. And the same thing with self-compassion. It's not poor me. It's really framing our experience in light of the shared human experience. Okay, everyone's imperfect. Everyone struggles. Some people struggle more than others. Yes, it doesn't deny that. But nonetheless, an intrinsic part of being human is the right to compassion, from this perspective anyway.
So to recap, Kristin says that the 3 elements of self-compassion are: first, mindfulness of your suffering; second, responding to that suffering with kindness and warmth towards oneself; and third, exhibiting a sense of connectedness, a shared sense of humanity. That is, to express to yourself, hey, you're not alone in this. What you're feeling is common to what it means to be a human.
So for instance, we know when we give ourselves compassion, we reduce cortisol and increase heart rate variability. So we're actually literally helping our bodies feel more safe. And that's, for instance, that's one of the reasons self-compassion is linked to more physical health, things like better immune function, because when your body's operating, feeling more safe, it actually functions better and you get sick less often. You sleep better also.
Can you talk a little bit more then about what the suggested interventions might be, or suggested best practices to cultivate this? I mean, you've kind of pointed to some with mindfulness meditation, but what are other people saying, okay, I want to try this? What would be some first steps you might suggest?
So what's really been surprising in my research is that it's easier than I had imagined it would be for people to be self-compassionate. It's hard to get in the habit of it because we're used to being critical. But the thing is, we already know how to be compassionate. We aren't like, it's not like learning a new skill. We already know how to be compassionate to others. So we already have the template that's fully formed. We really just have to give ourselves permission to use these skills with ourselves. So what you can do is one very easy thing you do, and actually there's research showing that this helps to dismantle shame, is if you just bring in intentionally the three components of self-compassion. So in other words, you're mindful of the fact that you're hurting, that you're feeling emotional pain. It could also be physical pain, right? This really hurts. It hurts to feel this way. I'm scared, I'm frightened, or, I feel horrible, whatever it is you're feeling. So validating that emotion with mindfulness, remembering that you aren't alone. And again, just reminding yourself, okay, there's nothing wrong with me feeling this way. This is part of being human. I'm not alone. So just intentionally reminding yourself of your humanity. And then giving yourself some words of kindness. And a very easy thing to do is to think, well, what would I say to a good friend who is in the exact same situation I'm in? What would I say to be kind and supportive to them? We already know that. And kind of what tone of voice would I use? And then you just turn that inward and say the same thing with yourself.
A practical way to do this? Kristin advises a letter writing exercise. Write yourself a letter daily for 7 days. Acknowledge the pain, stresses, strains that you're navigating. Affirm that it makes sense that these pains feel like a heavy load. And then say the kinds of encouraging things to myself that I would say to a friend who was working through similar difficulties. I find it easier myself to do this in the second person. So I begin the letter, Dear Lee, and continue on speaking to myself as if I were talking to a friend, acknowledging the challenges, offering words of compassion and encouragement. It all sounds terribly woo-woo, but it's fascinating. It is incredibly helpful.
And there's research that shows, for instance, people who did that in the letter writing exercise once a day for 7 days, their happiness increased by 6 months and their depression decreased for 3 months. So 6 months more happiness, 3 months less depression. It's pretty powerful for writing a little letter to yourself every day.
Yeah, for just a 1-week exercise.
1 a week exercise once a day. So again, it's pretty powerful stuff and it's not rocket science.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our episode exploring insights and practices into psychological flourishing. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and a full transcript. We would be most appreciative if you'd go to your favorite podcast app and write up a glowing 5-star review of No Small Endeavor, because those reviews help extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Coming up, we're going to talk about what researchers say is the number one factor for human happiness. And no, it is not money or fame or even chocolate.
I'm Shankar Vedantam, here to tell you about a great mystery. That mystery is you. As the host of a podcast called Hidden Brain, I explore big questions about what it means to be human. Questions like, where do our emotions come from? Why do so many of us feel overwhelmed by modern life? How can we better understand the people around us? Discover your hidden brain. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
If I told you that we've run the numbers and we in fact know the number one factor in human happiness, how much would you pay us for it? Well, it turns out that it's free. Robert Waldinger and Marc Schulz wrote a book about the world's longest scientific study on happiness. Here's Robert.
So the study started out as 2 studies that didn't know about each other when they started in 1938. They were both studies of what made young people thrive as they moved into adulthood, which was radical at that time because most research is on what goes wrong in human development. And this was what goes right, but they were such different populations. One was a group of Harvard College undergraduates, 19-year-old sophomores, and another was a group of boys from not just Boston's poorest neighborhoods, but from their most troubled families. Altogether, 724 original young men. And then we added wives. And then lately we've added the second generation, more than half of whom are women. So it's been going for 85 years.
And what did they find is the number one indicator of happiness in people's lives? Here's Marc.
So when we step back and look at the hundreds of findings from our study, and also importantly from studies outside of the Harvard study, because no one study is ever definitive, what we find is that relationships keep us happier and healthier throughout our lifespan. It's as simple as that. It's all kinds of relationships we're talking about, not just your closest partnership with, for example, the person you're married to, but it's relationships that include friends and relatives and people you work with. They're all important in keeping us healthy and happy.
Well, we didn't believe it at first when the data began to come in because, it makes sense that if you have better relationships, you're happier. But how could good relationships actually make it less likely that you'd get coronary artery disease or type 2 diabetes? Like, how could that be? And many other studies began to find the same thing. So for the last 10 years, Marc and I and our research group have been trying to understand the mechanisms by which relationships actually alter physiology. And many other research groups have been doing similar work for the last 20 years.
You also point to studies that have been done that indicate over the last 20, 30 years that there's a kind of a shift in, I don't know if it's adolescents, college-age students, in which they're increasingly desiring certain things that you now know from your study simply do not give what we anticipate it might give, greater wealth, fame, and so forth. So talk to us a little bit about those studies and kind of the shifting sands of what people think will give them some sort of good life.
Well, those things have been around. Those myths have been around for ages, right? The myth that wealth is going to make you happy. And the culture of materialism that we live in now kind of amplifies that. And social media certainly does. But it's been around. And now there have been, some decent studies. One famous one you may know about where they looked at how much happiness increases as your income goes up.
Yeah, that's the study by Deaton and Kahneman, I think it is. Yeah.
And their estimate, it was a few years ago, was $75,000 a year annual income was about the threshold that before you get to that level, you're meeting your basic material needs. And so happiness really does go up the more money you make until you get there. And then once you get beyond that, once your material needs are met, your happiness doesn't go up very much at all. So difference between 75,000 and 75 million isn't nearly as great as we would imagine it to be.
Yeah, you cite a 2007 survey in which millennials were asked about their most important life goals. 76% said that becoming rich was their number one goal. 50% said a major goal was to become famous. It was remarkable data there. That reminds me of one of your Harvard colleagues, Daniel Gilbert, who has talked a lot about that our brains are quite good at miswanting. And that seems to kind of overlap with what you're pointing us to there. Any commentary on that?
I think that there is a lot of truth there that when we try and figure out what's good for us, that we often make mistakes. That we talk about, psychologists use this term affective forecasting to capture the idea of what we imagine will make us happy. And I think we make mistakes when we predict the kinds of things that will make us happy. We probably pay attention too much to threats or to negative events. So talking to a stranger is scary for us because we imagine that that stranger will reject us or think that we're not interesting or not cool enough. So we tend to be biased towards negative outcomes, and it influences the decisions we make in terms of the social engagements that we have. And it influences it often in a negative way, that we don't have opportunities for connection that we might be able to benefit from.
It's one thing, I suppose, to note the importance of relationships and friendships. And then it's quite another thing to have the skills to practice healthy relationships and friendships. And you all spend a fair amount of time in later chapters in the book talking some about key practices, best practices. But can you point us to a few that you might want to highlight for listeners that you might want to suggest consideration of?
So one way we think about this is that we try and use the metaphor of social fitness. Just like our physical fitness, if we don't kind of exercise our social muscles, that they're going to wane, they're going to get weaker over time. So we all have people that we were quite close to in our life, maybe long ago, that we've lost that connection with. Maybe we've even lost touch with them. So a really important first step is just sort of stepping back a bit, thinking about your social universe, the connections that you have, thinking hard about the ones that are working well, that are energizing for you, and kind of doubling down and making sure, as Bob was suggesting, that you make time for them, those walks and those opportunities to talk, and devote your energy and attention on those relationships. And the other side is important too, thinking about relationships that haven't been working well or, have begun to lessen in their connection or their importance in your life, but those people are still important to you. Maybe it's a sibling that you've grown sort of less connected to over time, and trying to figure out how you can increase that sense of connection or restore that sense of connection. It often means reaching out and letting someone know that they're important, making time for that relationship. Those are really important first steps, I think.
Another avenue is to think about ways you may want new relationships. So some people feel they don't have enough connection in their lives. And they've actually done research on this and found that when you are in a situation where you see the same people repeatedly, you're more likely to strike up conversations and eventually deepen some of those conversations. And so one idea is to simply put yourself in a situation where you're doing something you care about alongside other people who care about the same thing, because you've instantly got something in common to talk about. It could be anything. It could be a bowling league. It could be a gardening club. It could be a political cause. It could be anything. But to put yourself in a situation where you see the same people repeatedly can be the beginning of deeper conversations and maybe a few friendships. The other thing is that being of service is often a very satisfying experience. And if you can be of service to people who want connection, be of service alongside people who want to do the same thing, that can be very helpful. Volunteering at a food pantry, older people reading to preschoolers, teaching English as a second language. There's so many things we can do with skills we already have. So those are some ways to think about connecting with new people if you want more people in your life.
So if warm relationships facilitate happiness, what then of loneliness?
The most popularly cited statistic is that loneliness is as toxic for our bodies as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Marisa Franco is a psychologist and author of the New York Times bestseller Platonic: How the Science of Attachment Can Help You Make and Keep Friends.
Which is wild because people will not smoke 15 cigarettes a day, but they'll go lonely for long periods of time. The reason is friendship makes us feel higher levels of oxytocin, which researchers also consider the fountain of youth as a hormone. And so the things that help us connect are also the things that keep us young. There's even research that when people are exposed to the common cold, they are many times less likely to actually contract it when they feel very connected to others. So I think people could guess that friendship does something for our mental health, which it definitely does. I mean, when you look at studies on very happy people, their most defining characteristic is not how spiritual they are, how much they exercise, all the things you'd expect. It is how connected they are. But there's also this very strong impact on our physical health as well, that our level of connection impacts.
What are the mechanisms behind that? I mean, why is that true?
Yeah, I mean, friendship really helps us regulate stress. If, for example, there's a study that found that out of 106 factors that predict depressive symptoms, having someone to confide in is the number one preventer. And stress causes long-term wear and tear on our bodies. There's an interesting study that when people evaluated how steep a hill was, they saw it as less steep when they were with a friend. So it's even before the stress hits us, we're internalizing it differently. But then once the stress hits us, we're also metabolizing it better. And then also that hormone oxytocin that I mentioned.
If you are experiencing loneliness, you might be thinking, well, that's just great and all, but I don't really have many people in my life. Well, Marisa wants to help in that regard as well.
Yes. Okay. So a lot of people think friendship should just happen organically. In adulthood, it doesn't. People that think that way are actually lonelier years later, because when you think that, you don't make an effort. You don't volunteer. You don't show up at that place of worship. It's a very self-sabotaging belief. And so the first thing that I tell people is you're going to have to try. You're going to have to reach out to people. Hey, I really enjoyed talking to you. Would you be open to connecting? Now, people are very afraid of rejection, particularly our insecure attachment styles. But I like to tell people about research on something called the liking gap. This finding that when strangers interact and they're asked how much they like each other, they underestimate how liked they are. And so we are liked by others more than we think. So that gives me like my tip for initiating is to try to assume that people are going to like you. I know that we all have these insecure parts that tell us otherwise, but like those insecurities aren't all of us. We can leave space beyond them to speak back, just like in your beautiful example, and say like, what if this goes right? Or I'm okay. Or like, I'll be okay no matter what happens. Or, what if this ends up being really enjoyable? What if I make a great friend? And this is based off of research on something called the acceptance prophecy. This finding that when researchers told people that they would be liked, they said, we did analysis based on your personality profile. You're going to go interact with this person. They're going to like you. And that wasn't true. They were deceiving the participants. But when people thought that way, they became friendlier and warmer and more open. Whereas we don't always realize, but when we fear rejection, we constantly reject people. We're closing our arms. We're kind of cold. We're sitting in the corner. I see my Gen Z students, they have their AirPods in their ears when they're like scared of people. And that becomes self-fulfilling because if we're rejecting people, they're not going to be comfortable engaging with us.
But practically, how to meet new people. You're standing in line, you're sharing a bus, you're waiting in the dentist office, especially when it seems the new social default is to stare at our devices.
I really like the insight and the question method. I don't remember who came up with this. It wasn't me, but it's sort of like you share something about your shared environment and then ask a follow-up question like, oh, it's a little like gloomy out today. Like, how do you like the winter weather? Or, oh, the holidays are coming up. Have you gotten any gifts? Or what's your favorite gift to receive? I think people put so much pressure on themselves to find the perfect thing to say. But as Nicholas Epley, one researcher says, is like, while nobody waves, everyone waves back. So as long as you break the seal, that's all that you need to do. You don't need to find the perfect line. You just need to break the seal and offer the opportunity to engage.
We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, ways to effectively respond and deal with stress, according to both wisdom traditions and evidence-based scientific research. Hello, friends. One of the things I've taught students for many years now is that one of the most important things they can do is pay attention to their meta habits, big habits that leave lots of things in their wake, and that this is key to living life well. For centuries, the cardinal virtues were thought of as just such meta habits, profound practices that have a disproportionately large impact upon your life. The four cardinal virtues: courage, temperance, prudence, and justice. They were considered essential to a good life, but today we hardly talk about them. Most people can't even name them. That's why we're launching a special 4-part series exclusively on NSE+. In this series, I'll take a deep dive into these virtues, what they mean, why they matter, and how they shape a meaningful life. Think of it like a private college course, except it's way practical. Episode 1 on courage is out now. We explore why courage is not fearlessness, but the ability to face fear wisely, and how practicing courage can change your life. Join us on NSE Plus to start listening today. Sign up at nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSE Plus. So far in this episode, we've covered 2 of the 3 areas which Dacher Keltner outlined as keys to human well-being. First, those perennial concerns of various religious and wisdom traditions towards compassion, forgiveness, empathy, love, and other perennial human intuitions. Second, sociability, or having warm and meaningful relationships. And now third, how we handle stress.
The official definition of stress is the perception that the thing that's happening exceeds your ability or resources to cope with it.
That's Judith Moskowitz, a social psychologist at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. More specifically, she studies the impact of positive emotion in the context of intensely difficult life circumstances.
In the context of stress, and basically in the context of life, negative emotions are normal and expected. You don't want to deny or suppress your negative emotions. But even in the midst of really extreme stress, people can experience positive emotions. And these positive emotions and positive events seem to be helping them cope better with this extreme form of stress.
Judith learned just how positive emotions can affect stress in the mid-1990s.
What I was studying at the time was men caring for their partners with AIDS. So some of the most extreme stress you can imagine experiencing. So the men in our study were caring for a partner who was dying. And then we also continued to interview them after the death of the partner. So the stress of caregiving and the stress of bereavement. And initially, we were asking questions about that stress. So asking them, what was stressful about caring for your partner or bereavement in the past week? What was a stressful event that happened for you? And then how did you cope with it? And shortly after the start of the study, the participants said, well, you're not asking us about the good things that are happening in our lives. And we were shocked as stress and coping researchers because we were studying stress. But they convinced us. And so we added a question. We then asked about something positive and meaningful that happened in the past week that helped you get through a day. And in almost every single interview after that, even if their partner had just died, the participants were able to talk about something positive that happened. So it was a real eye-opener for us to see that even in the midst of really extreme stress, people can experience positive things and positive emotions. And these positive emotions and positive events seem to be helping them cope better with this extreme form of stress. So we put together a multi-component program and started testing that in various groups. Usually it was health-related stress. And now we've expanded into all kinds of life stress where we can look at whether practicing these skills is helpful in maintaining well. So we have usually 8 to 10 skills. And the idea behind it is that, you don't have to do them all. We ask everyone to try each of the skills and see what works for them and then make that one a habit, right? So the skills include things like noticing positive events, which especially when you're under stress, can be really hard. So you think about the caregivers that I talked about earlier in this sort of really extreme stressful situation. Those who were able to notice a positive event, a lovely sunset, a beautiful flower, a walk on the beach, a good meal for their partner, did better. So we try to help people realize that, no matter how bleak things are, there's always something positive. And then related to that is savoring those events, or as we sometimes call it, amplifying or capitalizing on those events. And this is telling someone about it, or even thinking about it later on, or writing it in your journal, or putting it on social media so that you get that hit of positive emotion again. Go back and look at your vacation pictures for the good vacations, right? And savor that and be like, remember how great that vacation was. That's savoring. And that helps you re-experience that positive emotion again. The third skill we usually teach is gratitude, which, and again, these skills overlap to some extent. So gratitude has a lot in common with noticing positive events. It's just more about being grateful for things that are or things that happened. Sometimes it has a spiritual component, but it doesn't have to. You can certainly be grateful to other people or just grateful that things happened. You don't know the cause. There's a lot of work showing that just taking a moment either, daily or once a week to think about things you're grateful for can have a huge impact on certainly your psychological well-being, but physical health as well.
The remaining components are reframing events, noticing your personal strengths, setting and working toward attainable goals, displaying acts of kindness, and the last, mindfulness. You can hear more commentary from Judith on these practices on our full episode with her, available at nosmallendeavor.com or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
It helps enhance the use of the other skills because people are more emotionally aware and more aware of the positive events going on in their life, more aware of what they're grateful for. So that mindfulness skill and that practice of being more mindful really helps enhance the use of the rest of the skills.
What Judith is saying here about mindfulness, we've heard echoed in many of our guests time and again. And of all the guests with whom we've discussed mindfulness, one of them particularly stands out as the most practical?
Mindfulness is a mental mode. It's a way of making the mind, intrinsic to all of us. It has to do with present-centered attention that is essentially without emotional reactivity or conceptualization.
That's Amishi Jha, Director of Contemplative Neuroscience and Professor of Psychology at the University of Miami, as well as the author of the national bestseller Peak Mind, which explores her research on how attention can be trained for optimal performance and well-being.
Attention is obviously very important and, as we mentioned, vulnerable. But training it, there's not an obvious path on how to train it and strengthen it. And people have been trying for a very long time on how to do that. And most of the approaches involve training it with some kind of repetition of attentionally demanding tasks. So you come in front of a computer screen, you do things that require attention, and the notion was that if you do that enough, you'll have stronger attention. It doesn't seem to be the case. What people get really good at after doing this long-term training is the task. But now if you give them a slightly different task, they're no better than if they had never been trained at all. So it's this problem of generalizability that attention training solutions have really failed on. And that's where we're seeing the biggest benefit with mindfulness. So the family of practices with mindfulness training are aiming to cultivate both of those things: better attention and better sort of, let's call it better focused attention and better receptive attention. And the notion is that if you practice these things over and over again, the intrinsic appearance of mindful moments will increase in your moment-to-moment lives. And the formal way to do this is to take time out of your regular life to do a dedicated practice. Usually we want to do something that we might call stillness practice. So one category is what we call focused attention practices. Those are practices in which we pick an anchor for our attention, something as simple as the sensations of breathing in this moment. So I call it the find your flashlight practice. Set the intention to put your flashlight on a particular sensory experience. So coolness of air moving in and out of your nostrils, could be the feel of your feet on the ground. And that is going to be the goal for the formal practice. Keep the mind on that anchor. The second instruction of the focused attention practice is notice where the mind is moment by moment. And when you notice that the mind has wandered away from that anchoring object, return it back. So it's focusing, pointing that flashlight, noticing where the flashlight is, and then redirecting it back. And this is what I will often refer to as my military colleagues do, the mental push-up of mindfulness in 3 simple steps. And then we repeat over and over again. And we're, of course, not doing this for the purposes of just being Olympic-level breath followers. I mean, who cares if you feel the sensations of the breath? But it's that when you cultivate the capacity to steady your mind and point your attention willfully to where you want it to be, notice where the mind is moment by moment to see if you're on track or not, and then willfully get your attention back on track. That is a strengthening of a system that can be very useful no matter what you're doing, having a conversation with somebody or in a meeting or whatever it is. You first do these focused attention practices to learn how to sort of steady your mind. But now if you've done those for a while, you can move on to the river of thought practice, in which what you're doing is imagine yourself sitting on a giant boulder at the edge of a riverbank. And all of the mental content that arises is like the flowing of the river. And you are at this distance, allowing yourself to observe what is coming up and what is dissipating without holding on to any of it. And it's that distancing of yourself from the actual immersion in the content that can provide so much freedom in some sense, choice in what you do next. These are things we can do privately every day for a short period of time. Our research suggests as little as 12 minutes a day, and profoundly change the way we feel and our capacity to act effectively in the world. And I think that makes me very, very hopeful.
I'd like to end this episode back where we started, with the remarkable benefits of awe and wonder. Oliver Burkeman is the author of the best-selling book 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. The 4,000 weeks in the title is an allusion to the general number of weeks in a typical lifespan and evokes a sobering humility regarding the transitory nature of our lives. But somewhat counterintuitively, Oliver maintains that trying to squeeze every drop of pleasure out of life or every ounce of productivity out of a day is not the key to flourishing. Instead, one of the things he points us to is how awe and wonder can lead toward a life of meaning. He puts it like this.
When I step out of the house where we're living now in the very, very
beautiful part of the countryside which has no light pollution and see the stars, like then it's very easy to feel awe and wonder because it is this sort of extraordinary sight and an extraordinary environment to be a part of. But actually, there's nothing non-extraordinary about sitting on the subway or the grocery store. Like, what, from the perspective of the idea that any of this is at all, it's possible to be filled with astonishment by that. And I mentioned very briefly in the book an anecdote told to me by somebody else who lost a close friend sort of unexpectedly young and found himself asking like what his friend would have given to experience the things he was experiencing, even if those things were waiting in a long traffic jam or being on hold to an annoying customer service line or something. It's all these things that life is full of are sort of not pleasant in terms of their substance, but the fact that you are doing them and that death could take them away puts a different spin on it all.
In sum, pause often and therein to recollect the wonder of it all. What a wonder it is that I, you, we are alive at all. As a professor of ethics for more than 25 years, I've explored these kinds of questions around human flourishing with many students. And as host of No Small Endeavor, I've interviewed hundreds of people from diverse backgrounds, circumstances, and academic disciplines, also exploring such questions. All of which reminds me of that famed line from renowned philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who said, "The good life for humankind is the life spent in seeking for the good life for humankind." It's the pursuit itself, the exploration itself, that is at the foundation of a good life. So let's keep trying on for size, new practices and possibilities. Let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. That seems to be the necessary start of the path itself toward human flourishing. You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our exploration of the insight and practices we've learned over the last number of years about psychological flourishing and well-being. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.